So again, welcome everyone. It's Consent at Trent's first webinar for students at Trent, and the topic is boundaries. So here's our introduction. I'm Robin Ocean. I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention and Peer Support Coordinator, and I'll be your facilitator today. We have Riley Farquhar, who's summarizing and moderating the chat. This is how you can participate today. Polls will provide an interactive component, and they will be anonymous. So feel free to share what you're really thinking and feeling. The chat is available for questions. You can share examples that you're working on. Maybe some other people can comment on them as well as Riley. And participation is greatly appreciated. I think it would be more interesting for you if you reflect on what boundaries are and share that in the polls. I might keep up a quick pace, and that's just so we can get through all the content. Everything's important, but this is an intro session to boundaries, so I've crammed in quite a bit. This is a learning experience. If you need emotional support around boundaries, please share with a professional, and there'll be resources provided at the end. So here are our group agreements. This is a first example of setting boundaries. So we're setting some boundaries today about how we can participate and what it means to be in a learning environment together. We want you to bring your best, say what you mean, share what you feel comfortable with, never overshare. That's a personal boundary for you. If you don't feel comfortable, don't share. Bring examples to work on. It might be helpful. Maybe you have some boundaries that you want to work on, and just as something for self-reflection. And take something with you and reflect. That's always what we want from any learning experience. And just so you know, if we see any abusive or inappropriate messaging on the chat, Riley is going to address it. But hopefully we won't see any abusive comments, because our first boundary is to bring your best, and that wouldn't be bringing your best. These are our group agreements for today. So this session will be recorded. Hopefully you heard something when you joined. By continuing on from this point, you've consented to this recording. The purpose is to have this session available to those who could not attend. When it is recorded, I believe that your video and your name will not be shown. So it should still be anonymous. And again, the polling is anonymous too. So hopefully you feel comfortable and you're ready to share, and this is a good learning opportunity for us. Thanks again for joining. So what are we going to do here? We're going to leave with an understanding of what boundaries are, some structure to set and maintain your boundaries, and permission to set boundaries and take care of yourself. So we're going to go through the what, who, how, and why, and the when and the where is up to you. So when you set your boundaries and where you set them is for you to uncover. So let's begin. See, we're setting our first boundary. This is where the intro part has ended and the part where you participate will begin. We're going to start with a poll. It's a little bit lengthy. I'll probably give about a minute for you, or even longer, for you to read the questions and respond. And it's a self-reflection. So I'm launching the poll now. So click all that apply to you. And again, your answers will be anonymous. So just think how you approach different things in your life, how you approach boundaries, time, and energy. And I'll give you a minute to respond. So you can click on all that apply to you. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to respond. I'm going to share the results with you. We can see that a lot of people feel guilty when other people aren't happy, as if we're responsible for other people's feelings. So it's important to set a boundary right there. We are not responsible for other people's feelings. If we take that on, if we absorb that, then it's like we're not allowed to do anything without imagining how some independent, autonomous person is going to respond. But we can't control their response, and we have to take care of ourselves. Another thing that people experience a lot is you say yes to a person when you really want to say no. And so we have to start thinking about why. Why don't we feel like we can say what we mean? Why don't we feel like we can do what works for us? So people feel taken for granted by others, give away a lot of their time. I can see we have a lot of very generous people in this webinar today. Being generous is a gift, it's wonderful, but can we give too much and have nothing left for ourselves? What do we do in those situations? So thanks again for sharing. So your feelings and experiences are valid. Anything that you responded to in that poll, we all have past pain or trauma around boundaries. Boundaries is about saying what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with. And some people push those boundaries, or we feel like we're not allowed to set them, you know, that guilt that you were talking about. We may have learned bad examples of boundary setting or have experienced people crossing our boundaries. I mean, you didn't wake up one day and say, boundaries aren't for me, right? That's some learning that we're doing in our relationships. Be kind and gentle with yourself as you learn to set boundaries, and learn to respect other people's boundaries. So nothing that you're learning today is only for you. It's for all of us, which means that if we're learning to set them and we want others to respect it, we have to make sure that that's reciprocal. So what are boundaries? This is the big what question of why we're here today. Boundaries are a life-enhancing system of yes and no. And it's really important for you to know that they enhance relationships. Boundaries mean I care about you, but I have to care about me first. I mean, you've all heard you can't pour from an empty cup. So we have to make sure that our cup is full. It's about behavior you're comfortable with or uncomfortable with, and it's about safety. So it's really important. And what kind of boundaries are there? There's a few different kinds of boundaries: emotional, physical, mental, material, time and energy. And now there's COVID boundaries. So you have to think about the context that we're in is quite different. So Brene Brown, a great researcher, she said, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. So remember that we can't control how someone else is feeling if they're feeling disappointed, but it's the courage to take care of ourselves that we need. So here's some example of 5 different boundaries. I'll explain a little bit more. So the material boundaries, that determines whether you can give or lend things such as money, your car, clothing, books. Maybe you're sharing a textbook with a classmate, or even your toothbrush, like what you have that you're able to share. Physical boundaries pertain to your physical space, your personal space, your privacy, your body. Do you give a handshake or a hug? To whom and when? How do you feel about loud music, locked doors? You know, what do you need in your personal bubble, in your space, to feel comfortable and safe physically? And mental boundaries, that's about your thoughts, your values, your opinions. Do you know what you believe, and can you hold on to your opinions? Can you listen with an open mind to someone else's opinion without becoming rigid? If you have become highly emotional or argumentative or even defensive, is that helpful? Is that you setting a boundary to take care of yourself? Or is it about putting out a rigid boundary when really it's a moment for learning? Just questions to ask yourself. Emotional boundaries, that's when you feel something. Can you distinguish it from a fact? Can you ask yourself, is this a feeling or a fact? Because that's a really great way of tuning into what you're feeling, instead of telling yourself a message like it's true. Because all of your feelings are valid, but if we think something is a fact, it might influence what decisions we make, when really, if we sit with our feelings, we might be able to let them go. Do you take on other people's emotions? Are you a sponge? You know, have you heard this word empath? When we're such an empath, we have empathy and feel for so many people that it's really draining for us. So do we need emotional boundaries around that? So healthy boundaries prevent you from giving advice, blaming, or accepting blame. Sometimes someone wants your advice, but did they set the boundary? Did they say, do you want some advice, right? And I'm a counselor myself, so I have to remember to ask that, especially to my friends and families. Well, no one in my family wants my advice, but with my friends, I have to say, are you open to advice? Or are you looking for problem solving? You know, that's just a boundary to ask. And time and energy. You have to ask yourself, what is worth your time and energy? Because they're valuable, and all of these boundaries are connected. So think about each one of them and how you're able to maintain what you need for your life and how much you're able to give at the end. So we give boundaries, we set them to other people, for other people in our lives, but we also set boundaries and give boundaries with ourselves. So here's some example of boundaries you can set with yourself, and hopefully you have more control over the responsibility of yourself to show up in boundaries. So mental, I don't want to think about that anymore. Maybe you need to set that boundary and say, I can't think about that. Emotional, I'm allowed to feel this. Maybe it's about making space for feelings, like I mentioned. Material, that might be about sticking to a budget. How much money do you want to spend this month? That's a boundary you set with yourself. Physical, keeping your personal bubble safe, right? Maybe it's about taking a step back when you feel like someone is too close to you. And this is definitely a time to do that. And time and energy, maybe it's about putting down your phone just with yourself. Oh, I don't want to scroll anymore on social media. I'm going to set a time and energy boundary with myself. And hopefully you can show up for yourself and respect your own boundaries. It's a good foundation. So work boundaries. I know many of you are student staff. So do you have work friends and social friends? Do you already have a boundary around that? That's a work boundary. Does your work become your whole life? How does that impact you? Do you need to set a boundary between work and life? And what are the parameters of your job? Do you overstep them? Do you think, what's my role here? Because knowing what your role is having a work boundary. Be aware that interpersonal conflict can upset the whole workplace. Examples of work boundaries that you might want to set, and maybe your workplace wants you to set these as well. Refraining from intimate relationships with coworkers, limiting the amount or intensity of personal information you share. Listen, sharing is beautiful, right? Being vulnerable really allows us to connect. But are you going to share too much information and then start to feel worried about it or uncomfortable? Not sharing personal social media accounts with customers, clients, students, whatever you want to say. Who do you add and why? Will people feel left out? What if someone direct messages you off work hours? What's your role? You know, if you add everybody, but you don't add this one person, they're going to feel left out. How is that going to impact you or them or your working relationship? So just some things to think about. What are your work boundaries? What are the boundaries that your workplace has set? And how can you maintain those as well? So it's for personal and professional. So social media, how do we set boundaries around social media? This is a tricky one. You know, do you have a public account? Do you have a private account? So I'm going to ask you and see. So I'm going to set up this poll and see what you have. So think about your social media. Maybe it's Instagram, Facebook. What are you people using? TikTok. Do you have a public or a private social media account? I'll give you a minute to respond to the poll. And remember, there's no judgment here. I mean, I personally can't understand having a public account unless it's business related, but people have it to share their art or to share their photography and things like that. There's lots of reasons to have a public account. Okay, thanks for sharing. Yeah, so most people have a private account. Some people have both. And some people have a public account. So we just want to make sure that you feel safe with the account that you have and it makes sense for you. I'm the sexual violence prevention coordinator, and so I worry about public accounts, especially when you check in about where you are. I feel concerned about where you are and why people need to know where you are. But you take care of yourself and you check in with that boundary for yourself. So in this example, your public account, what is your forward-facing life like, you know, is for this teacher? It's like, I love teaching. And then a private account is talking to her friends and saying that she's really stressed out. So who do you share with and why? Something to consider. So what about COVID boundaries? We are in an unprecedented moment of time about boundaries, about physical space boundaries. What are some COVID boundaries you've implemented? What have you seen others ask for, and how has it been to maintain their boundaries? Have you noticed society's response to the government's boundaries? You know, we've seen protests about that. What does that mean about setting boundaries? This is a serious test of our boundaries, and the results not about not respecting your boundaries, it can be really dangerous. And although it's an extreme case, I want us to think about that for all of our boundaries. It can be dangerous if we don't maintain our boundaries. It's a danger to your well-being. It can be in danger to your relationships because you can grow in resentment. So for now, we have to practice social and physical distancing, which is a clear boundary to set and maintain. So who are boundaries with? So this is the who section of the webinar. So I'm going to ask you a poll again. So this is an opportunity to participate. So the question is, who is the most difficult person to set boundaries with? Just pick one of the most difficult people to set boundaries with. So you'll have to set a lot of boundaries, you know, in your life. And I'm sure they're all difficult, especially if you're a person that hasn't set boundaries before, but just think, who's the most difficult person? Okay, thanks for sharing. So it looks like a parent is one of the most difficult people to set boundaries with. And I have a lot of opinions on that because I agree. Setting boundaries with my mom is probably the most difficult. And that could be because of the generational difference. It could be because of this perceived authority of a parent. There's lots of reasons why that might be difficult. But it's also, all of these people are difficult to set boundaries with. I think it's interesting that it's harder to set boundaries with your phone than with a friend. Great. I hope that means that it's not so hard to set boundaries with our friends, because that's really important. So romantic partners, your phone, yourself are really hard to set boundaries with. Thanks for sharing. Relationships are complex. We care about people, so we let them in, and we need boundaries to keep ourselves safe. Remember, and I'm going to say this a million times, boundaries enhance relationships. So when you start worrying someone's going to be disappointed or mad or you should feel guilty, remember that the more boundaries you set with the best communication you can, your relationship will be enhanced. And our boundaries change based on the relationship it is. Our relationships with our friends, family, coworkers, our romantic partners, the boundaries we set in all those relationships might look really different. So hold space for the complexity of these relationships and make room for ebb and flow. Sometimes if we have people in our lives that don't respect our boundaries, there's a time where we feel that we have the capacity to accept that. And there are times that we have to set a hard boundary and say, no, I can't be your friend right now. So these are some examples of where you can set your personal boundaries and with who. You might have your family close to you, your friends in this next realm, depending on what you share. Then you have your acquaintances and strangers. This map might look totally different for you. You might keep family further from your life and set more physical and emotional boundaries from them. And you keep friends right close to you. So it's up to you. It's totally personal. Remember that relationships are complex. You may need to set some serious boundaries with somebody that a friend really lets into their life. So we can't compare. So ask yourself, who are you setting boundaries with and why? Are these relationships healthy? Because boundaries help keep them healthy. So we have to check in. Are they toxic? And do they add or drain your life force? Like, do we have people in our lives that we feel like are taking so much from us? Here's an example. I won't have expectations of a person that they can't meet, because then when I'm disappointed, it's actually my fault because they never had the capacity to meet that expectation. So I can't set that expectation. And sometimes expectations and boundaries are quite similar. So I might set a boundary that I won't allow myself to be disappointed because they can't let me down, because there is no expectation. Hopefully that makes sense. So here's some personal examples. So I'm setting an emotional boundary with myself that I feel comfortable sharing this personal example with you. My friends no longer ask me to do any of the following: help them move, help them paint, help them cook, do things late at night. I don't stay up late. Do more than 2 things in a day. Like, let's say they want to go to a museum, which I love, and then go for dinner, and then go for drinks, and then hang out at someone's house. I'll do 2 of those things max, but I don't want to cram so much into one day. My friends don't ask me to spend lots of money. And we have a special code, and it's called Do My Stupid Thing. It's for when you really need help, support, or fun with your friend, and you want them to push outside their comfort zone. And so that's an example of setting boundaries, but having space to remove those boundaries. So my example is say hi to your mom. My friend Chelsea always tells me, say hi to your mom. And when I say hi to my mom from Chelsea, my mom says, say hi to Chelsea for me. And I just think, why don't you 2 people talk yourselves? So that's why I hate doing that. And when people say hi to your mom, I say no. But if my friend says, do my stupid thing, say hi to your mom, then I'll be like, okay, I accept. It's more important for you that I say hi than it is for me to not say hi. Do you know what I mean? The point is that I'm making those choices. I'm setting those boundaries for myself. I get to decide where they go. So with new friends, I have to share these boundaries. So before I move on, I just want to check in with Riley and see what she's seeing in the chat and if there's anything to share.
Hi, Robin. So one really great question in the chat was someone was wondering if spiritual boundaries, spiritual or psychosocial boundaries fit into one of those 5 categories that you discussed earlier, or maybe they're their own category, and how does that work?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So I think you get to set your own boundaries, and if that feels separate and sacred, then make that a different kind of boundary. But I'm wondering if it connects to emotional boundaries, if a spiritual boundary connects to even time and energy, right? How much time and energy you spend on doing things that restore you and your soul. So that is really up to you. But thanks for bringing that one up, because I think when we think of the circle of courage or the wellness wheel, we know that spirituality is a really important part. So thanks for bringing that up. Any other questions or things to bring up, Riley?
That's about it so far. Just a lot of welcomes, and glad everyone's here.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, so feel free to go into the chat when you have questions, and we'll periodically check in with them. So thanks for asking. So let's talk about barriers. There's lots of barriers to set up boundaries. Otherwise, we would all have really good boundaries, right? We don't have no boundaries for no reason. So what's in the way? What are you scared of? So I'm going to set this other poll asking you that question, and you can answer any ones that fit for you. You want to set boundaries. What barriers are in your way? Just take a moment to reflect. You're ready to set a boundary. You know that you're uncomfortable about something. What's in your way? Okay, thanks for sharing. So it seems like predominantly we feel guilty. And it's so important for us to acknowledge that. I don't want to do something for myself because I will feel guilty. When we say that, doesn't that sound like we're missing something? Doesn't that sound like that's not the purpose of our relationships and our life, is to just feel guilty, so guilty that it is what, starts to move us down our path instead of something more connected, like joy or dreams or goals, but instead we're motivated by guilt. Something to reflect on. And it's so common. And so remember, we're not judging any of these feelings. All of your experiences are totally valid, but we have to acknowledge that we feel guilty and try to remove that barrier. We also are worried that we'll be annoying. Oh, it's annoying to say no. It's annoying to ask for what we need. Other people feel that way too. You feel like you'll be rejected. You just feel too shy to set a boundary. And this one's really hard to see. No one listens anyway. So when you're even ready to set your boundary, you feel like nobody's listening to you. And I'm sorry to hear that. So let's all remember to learn our boundaries and learn to respect other people's boundaries. So how do we remove some of those barriers? Well, we can affirm ourselves with confidence. You will believe the following if you have healthier boundaries with yourself. I can say no. I am still a good person. I can say yes. I am in charge of my life. These are the ways to push through that guilt. And if we can say these things, then we have set healthy boundaries with ourselves emotionally. So feel free to jump on the chat if you have different affirmations that help you set boundaries. That would be cool to hear how other people set their boundaries with themselves. So how to set boundaries. Now we're at the how, and this is probably why you're here. So that was all the foundational stuff to think about what's in the way, who is in our lives, and what boundaries are. So now we want to figure out, how do we set boundaries? The first question to ask is, how do I know what boundaries to set? And remember, your boundaries may shift over time. But think about your goals. Think about your needs, your wishes. Think about your time and energy, because remember, one very important boundary is about time and energy. Think about your capacity. Think about your feelings. Just think about you. Where are you at? What are you able to do, right? Because if we say we're able to do something and then we're not, then we're really letting ourselves and that other person down. It might be better just to say, I can't do it. I don't have the capacity. So how do you set boundaries? Make them clear, make them realistic, make them strong, make them yours no matter what. So remember, when I asked what the barrier was, many of you said guilt. So that's about the other person. That's not about you. So you have to make your boundaries about you. And I know some people are hearing that and thinking, oh, that sounds selfish, but it's not. Remember that it's not selfish. It is self-preservation to take care of yourself. You need to shift that idea. And then we need to share that with others. So if someone is taking care of themselves, say, great, encourage them. So here's the thing. If a boundary falls in the woods and you didn't communicate it, does it make a sound? What I mean is communicate your boundaries, right? If you had a boundary in your mind No one can read your mind, I think. If any of you can read your mind, hopefully you've become millionaires. If a boundary falls in the woods, make sure that someone can hear it. When we have expectations and don't communicate them, again, it's our fault that we're disappointed. So how do you set personal boundaries? Here's some other ways of looking at it. So identify the desired boundary. So I really narrow it down to what it is. What are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with? Communicate, say what you need. So I know that that's hard for people who are shy or feel like people aren't listening to them, but this is really important. We need to all get better at communicating. Stay simple, don't over-explain. And I'll get into more why over-explaining kind of leaves your boundary shaky, but you don't owe anybody an explanation. If you need something, if it's about your safety, your comfort level, your capacity, you don't owe somebody an explanation. And set consequences. And I know consequences might be a hard word, but say why it's important to you, what matters. So here's an example. Let's say someone is always late to meet you. You want them to meet you on time. So that's the definition of the boundary. That's the desired boundary you want. Or they should at least communicate in advance if they're going to be late. And then communicate. I'd like you to be on time to meet me. I change my plans to accommodate our meeting, and then I have to wait for 45 minutes, and that's really uncomfortable for me. And then stay simple. Don't say what you'd rather be doing or why it's a waste of your time for 45 minutes. It's just that your friends should respect your time. It doesn't require an explanation. And number 4, the consequences. Here's an example. If you don't let me know in advance, then I can't make plans with you that involve us meeting somewhere, because then I'm just like sitting on a bench for 45 minutes and I don't want to. So if you want to meet up again, you can come over to my house because I'm already there. That's just an example of how you can set a boundary with a friend. And here's some more examples. And remember, you can set them with others or with yourself. So here's some example with others. Encouraging no screen time during quality time, right? Let's say it's the 2 of you and you just want to be present, maybe been on your phone for days and you just want to be able to enjoy someone's company. You have to communicate that. Making priorities with others about things that are important to you. So if school's important, what boundaries do you need to set with your friends, family, even your work about that, as well as the rest. So school, work, relationships, etc. Who are you setting boundaries with and what are you trying to prioritize? Not letting everyone into your life. Some people will want to let everyone into their life. That's great, but check in with yourself. What's your capacity? How is it benefiting you? How are these relationships impacting you? Communicating with a sexual partner about your comfort and safety. This is obviously super key as someone who talks about consent all the time. Our physical boundaries are also emotional and mental, and all of them spiritual. It's about our time and energy too. I think they're all connected. So we have to communicate and we have to make sure we feel safe to communicate. And that's what consent is. And so here's some examples with yourself. Limiting screen time with yourself. Right? Like we said, maybe we want to take a break from social media. I don't know about you, but I can scroll on Instagram for 4 hours and look at pit bulls being adopted, you know? So sometimes I have to say, enough pit bulls for now. So with yourself, you might make priorities, self-care, self-compassion, goals. I got a text from a friend this morning that said she was taking the day off of work for a mental health day, which, you know, we have to applaud and congratulate her for because she works so hard. And she deserves a break. So take that with yourself. Not giving your time to everyone who asks. Do you have time for every single person? Again, just check in with yourself. And being kind to yourself about your body, that might be a boundary to set with yourself. So how can you set a firm boundary if you're uncomfortable with the request, right? Because when we're uncomfortable with the request, it's going to be even harder to set it. So here's the example. A friend asks you for $20. How can you respond? So remember, you're uncomfortable with giving $20. So how can you respond to the request? So I'll give you a minute to share your response. So I know this one's really hard because it's about money, and money can be a really uncomfortable topic, right? Okay, let's see the responses. So most people will say, no, I don't feel comfortable loaning money to friends. That's a firm boundary, right? That's a solid no. And that's a no for now and for the future. Of course, that might change, but that's a little bit safer for you to say no and for the future. The next answer was, sorry, I can't loan you $20. I don't have any to spare. The thing with that is that just means that when you do have $20 to spare, you can loan it. So it's up to you. If you feel like you don't want to share money between friends because it's not something you're comfortable with, or it's not money that you often have, then you want to set the firm boundary of, I'm not comfortable with that action. But if it's just about, I don't have $20 in my pocket, just remember that when you do have $20 in your pocket, someone might be asking for it. Just something to think about. Because that's about excuses, right? So let's talk about excuses. If you make an excuse to why you can't do something, the person can use that against you by making your excuse irrelevant. Here's an example. Let's go to a movie tonight. You say, I don't have a ride. They respond, I'll pick you up. You say, I have homework to do. They respond, you can do your homework tomorrow. I'll even help. You say, I've already seen that movie. They respond, we can see something else. You say, I'm tired. They say, I'll buy you a coffee. You say, I have a headache. They respond, here, take an Advil. I know this sounds silly, but I know you've all experienced this, right? You say no to something, you even explain, even though I'm telling you, you don't have to explain. And they will find any way to try to make it so that your excuse is irrelevant. So suddenly everyone's a lawyer, right? It's like being cross-examined. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Your words are enough. That's why you don't have to over-explain. Here's an example. Here's a field, and this field is your life, and all your friends and coworkers and romantic partners and whatever are running through this field because there's no boundaries. And they get all of your time and energy, they get all your $20, they get all your movie dates, they get everything. And you buy the popcorn. And they're running free, and these are all of your relationships. So now imagine that you set a boundary, and it's your first time, and you're not going to make excuses for yourself, and you're going to set a firm boundary because you know what's important to you, and you've learned about boundaries. Well, now there's a fence in the field that they've never seen before. So what are they going to do when they come up against the fence? They might be mad at it. Why is this fence here? This is my big, beautiful field. This is where I spend all my time. I'm free. I get whatever I want from this field. Why is this fence here? They might try to punch the fence. They might try to jump over the fence or dig under it. They might just bang on the fence and say, get out of here, right? And that is because they're just getting used to it. So what would happen if you just keep maintaining that fence is that eventually they'll find that there's enough green grass on their side of the fence and that they're getting what they need from your park, if you know what I mean. So now let's imagine that we set a gate in that fence, and that's an excuse. So, oh, I would lend you $20, but I don't have any. And then they, like a lawyer, come back and say, I'll drive you to the ATM. When you said, I don't have any on me right now, you've set a gate in that fence that they can open if they're clever enough. And so these are all choices for you. If you want that green field where they can run everywhere, just remember, you might start losing your grass and it might have some muddy parts from where they've been really worn down. If you set that boundary, remember that it's new and people might bump up against it. Give them time. Relationships ebb and flow. Keep your boundary firm if that's comfortable for you. And remember that if you set an excuse, if you over-explain, you're building a gate and you're allowing people to get through your boundary. Hopefully that makes sense. So before I move on, I'm just going to jump back to Riley. Riley, any questions or comments from the chat?
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. So there's some interesting points being made. Someone made the point that, sometimes for them, they might say to some friends just no, or that it might differ from person to person, or on different situations. And so they felt that maybe the poll wasn't fitting for an option that they maybe needed, which I think makes sense. And I think you'll touch on that a little bit more. And then I had a couple other questions come up. And so these were sent to me privately. And so if anybody wants to remain anonymous, I'm not going to mention any names when I bring it up in the discussion. So you can send a message to me privately in the chat. But someone was wondering if they associate their self-worth with how much they push themselves and how much they work, for example. And how might they get past that? How might they get past, you know, assigning so much value to themselves for pushing past their boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have a lot of pressure in our lives to set our value and our self-worth to how productive we are, to our self-esteem, to our sense of who we are based on our output and productivity. And I think we're seeing that now more than ever, right? If COVID has changed things for you, then you feel less productive and you feel less valuable. I mean, more people are going to experience some depressive symptoms than ever have before. And so that's about sitting down with yourself and setting boundaries for what works for you. When I work this hard, do I feel replenished and restored, or do I feel drained? And if I feel drained when working this hard, when making my job my life, who am I doing it for? And we are going to get a little bit to that. So you're asking really important existential questions. And I just invite you to keep asking those and explore those questions with kindness, have empathy for you. Again, you didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to work myself into the ground. Okay. It comes from media, it comes from our family patterns. It comes from a boss that pushes you too hard, perhaps, whatever it is in the entire lifetime before you've gotten to here. It's all influencing you. So just take some safe space to unpack that and find that no matter what, I promise you, you have value. You just have value as a person, whatever it is. We have to look for all the ways that we show that. And maybe it's a moment of solitude with yourself when you tell yourself a joke and you smile, you know, that was valuable even though nobody was around. So we need to really reshift our focus on what value is. And in terms of the first thing that you mentioned, Briley, you know, thanks for bringing that up. Boundaries are different for everybody. There are some friends that we can say no to. There are some friends that will need a 10-page paper explaining why that no is there. The boundary to set first is with yourself. Do I feel like I have the capacity to follow through with this boundary? That's why you're in charge of setting them and maintaining them. And it's not easy. Have I said that yet? This is what boundaries are simple. Like we put the fence up, there it is. But it's not easy, okay? You have to build that fence. You have to get the materials. That's as much I can do in the analogy because I don't know how to build anything. Okay.
There was another interesting question on here about, you know, some boundaries are easy to set with certain people, but sometimes, say, for example, with your parents, and we talked about, I think a lot of us can relate to that because we saw how difficult it was for people to set those boundaries. Mm-hmm. Some people just don't respect them or aren't used to you setting boundaries. And they may kind of push it, and that there may be, you know, cultural differences or generational differences that can occur in that process. So what do you do in those cases?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the idea of bumping up against the boundary, is that it is really hard for some people to respect or to hear us. And what we do then is, if we can't set that boundary with them, after trying as hard as we can, we have to set a boundary with ourselves. It might be to distance ourselves from that person if possible. It might be an emotional boundary with yourself. I just can't worry about this anymore because I've done everything that I can. I've done my best. And I know that that can be difficult, but again, it's setting that boundary so that you have some maintenance of your emotional energy.
And then there's another question, Robin, about what if friends really want an explanation to your no? Especially maybe, I guess, if you just plainly say no. Because when you say no, the next question is always, why can't you? Why not? And this person felt that you often have to rely on these excuses. Sometimes, I mean, I've caught myself telling white lies before to, you know, kind of back out of that situation. So what would you recommend in those cases?
I just want to validate that you're not making excuses for no reason. You're making excuses because you feel like your no isn't respected, right? And you might even make up a white lie because you're not allowed to just tell your truth. So I just want to validate that. A lot of us can relate to that. But it's about building that fence and how much can you maintain it? Because if you say no, and that's all I'm going to explain, that person might bump up against it, but eventually they might accept your no. And if they don't, what does that mean for your relationship? So it's a decision for you to make. It's a conversation for you to have with yourself, because there are some people that need you to explain. My example of my list of personal boundaries, I sent that to my friend and she said, why didn't you give this to me 6 years ago? because I didn't have it written down 6 years ago, but I've spent 6 years trying to explain some of those things to her. But she was the person in my life that never accepted my no. And now she does, and it's just a no. And she says, okay. So it's taken her 6 years to really hear me. But I checked in with myself and I thought that relationship was worth it. So again, it's all up to you. It's personal and it's complex. So I just want to validate that you can do it and it's hard. So thanks for those questions.
You said something too, Robin, about people coming to you with, what does that mean about your relationship? So it may come to a point, I imagine, where you have to set boundaries about your boundaries.
Yes.
Like, you're not respecting my boundaries.
Exactly. So that's just another layer of setting an emotional boundary with yourself that might cause a physical boundary of staying away from a person. And I know that that hurts, but again, if we don't take care of ourselves, we're pouring from an empty cup. Okay, thanks, Riley. I'll move on from now and I'll check back in with you. So what does it mean when you break your own boundaries? I think this is a good segue. When you do something for someone, do you ever leave it open? You know, you say anytime, no worries, no problem. Do you mean it? Do you want to leave it so open? Can they call you anytime to ask for help? What about 2 o'clock in the morning? I hope all of your phones are on mute at night, just FYI. But be clear with your words and say what you mean. Because again, it's probably better to say you can't do something than promise you can, then back out last minute because you really can't, right? So do what you say what you do what you mean, all of those things to say, don't break your own boundaries. If there's one boundary you're gonna break, don't make it to yourself. Remember, you're allowed to say no. So maybe this encompasses all of those really great questions about how do I do this? People don't respect me, or they want so much more from me. Here's just some permission for you. And remember, it's simple, but it's not easy. You're allowed to say no. Here's some ways. I don't want to. I'm not interested. I'll let you know when I feel I have more time. No, thank you. Or that's not my thing. Just give yourself that permission. You may be worried that if you say no, you'll be excluded. So communicate. No, thanks for including me. Ask me another time, right? Because remember, some of you felt guilty. Some of you feel like no one's going to listen anyways. Here's an example. Hey, want to join my bowling club tonight? Oh, that sounds lovely, but bowling really isn't my thing. Dinner soon though? So you're saying, enjoy your bowling. It's not for me. Here's something else we can do together. So hopefully for some people asking, how do I set these boundaries with people that are difficult to set boundaries with? Think about this. You're saying thank you, you're appreciating it, and you're going to make a different plan. So I have another question for you. How does it feel when your boundaries are violated? Because many of you are talking about how difficult it is to set the boundaries, which makes me think, you know, you've tried to set them and they haven't been listened to. So here's the question. How does it feel when you set a boundary and it is not respected? You can choose as many that fit for you. Okay, thank you. So for most people, it feels unfair. We can relate to that, right? It feels like I just went through all this effort. I'm trying to enhance the relationship. I'm telling you what I need. It's unfair that it's not being respected. You'll just do what the other person wants. Yeah, you feel guilty. You feel, pressured. It feels bad. It feels annoying. It feels like a betrayal. This is someone that's supposed to care for you. Shouldn't they care about what you need? And I'm telling you, yes, they should. You might think, fine, whatever. Maybe you feel like you are a laid back person. So it's okay. It is what it is, and it's up to you how you can respond. But I agree that I think it is really unfair and it hurts us. So remember, not respecting people's boundaries does not enhance the relationship. It hurts it. So listen, we are allowed to say no. Okay. Remember, give yourself permission, but so can they. Let's make room for no. Right? We want to be able to say no and for people to accept it. So you have to make room for other people saying no. Don't take it personally. Don't make it about you. Encourage that person's boundary setting. Make space for rejection. It's another part of life to get used to, and it helps us to grow. What does it mean to not have boundaries? So this is a picture of somebody trying to take care of themselves, right? You can't pour from an empty cup. You have to self-nurture. If we can't set boundaries, who can we have in our life? What does it mean if we have people in our life that don't respect our boundaries? I know these are really tough questions, something to reflect on. There can be pain and discomfort without boundaries. You might have to make tough calls. Maybe this person can't be in your life. Maybe you can't share anymore with that person. And again, that'll ebb and flow in time. Maybe eventually that will change. But it can lead to resentment if you don't have boundaries. And that's, again, hurting and harming the relationship. Boundaries enhance relationships. Not having boundaries harm a relationship. Deciding to give someone a second chance for not respecting your boundary, that might be okay for you. The point is, it's your boundary to set. And as always, I'd like to say safety first, okay? Maintain your boundaries for safety. Look what this adorable dog did. What happened here? If you don't set the baby gate, the dog will eat your house. Okay, that's an example of not having boundaries. And my question is, who has to clean it up? You. Okay, so set that baby gate. Don't let the dog eat your house. I want you to ask yourself, whose life is this? And I don't know the proper grammar, so I just put both. Whose life is this? Is someone else dragging you along, making decisions for you? You have to deal with the consequences, not them. That's why it's really hard when somebody else makes a decision for us. You are responsible for yourself. This is your life. And remember to be aware of toxic or violent or narcissistic people in your life. So if you've heard the word narcissist before, a narcissist will not respect your no and might ask for a whole 10-page essay. Not that every single person who doesn't respect a no is a narcissist, but solid, fenced boundaries are the best way to support a relationship with someone who's that draining, who doesn't have any empathy for you. The reason someone needs to respect our no, everyone, is because they should care that we're saying no, because we're addressing our needs, and they should care about that. So when we start asking ourselves why don't they accept our no, we're going to figure something out. The only people who get upset about you setting boundaries are the ones that were benefiting from you having none. It's going to be hard for them to adjust and for you to adjust. Things will change. The goal is for you to be free and safe and respected in the end. The goal is for you to live your life because you're the only person that can. So remember, if they get upset about you setting boundaries, they were benefiting from you having them. No is a complete sentence, right? This moves beyond consent, but boundaries are all about consent. So we can borrow from that in anything in our life. It's a complete sentence. Do you want to do this? No. I don't see why the response should be why, right? And maybe we need to communicate that. When I say no and you say why, I feel very uncomfortable because I said no and I can make that decision for myself. I'm autonomous, I'm smart, I deserve respect. When I say no, I've thought about it. I don't need you to convince me. That's some things to respond. So let's review. If we don't set boundaries, we're letting our heart get trampled on potentially. We're going to build resentment. Boundaries enhance relationships. So check in with yourself, check in with your heart. Set boundaries that are clear, communicate them, make them solid. The result will be your freedom. Boundaries enhance relationships. I'll say that 1,000 times. We did the what, who, and how of boundaries, and the where and the when is up to you. So I'll go back to Riley. Any last questions, Riley, from the chat?
There's some great comments and questions happening. There is a bit of a follow-up from one of the questions before about, maybe setting boundaries with people who don't necessarily respect them. Do you sometimes have to maybe close relationships, even if it's, say, with your parents or family members, or is it better to suck it up, or is there kind of an in-between there?
Yeah, thanks. It's not better to suck it up, but you can set that emotional boundary for whatever that means. If it's like my relationship with this person is more important than how they treat me, that's a really tough choice to make, but it's yours. And then you might have to make some tough choices of saying, I can't be with this person. So I don't mind sharing that I have cut off an entire parent in my life. Of course, that's difficult, but it's because I knew that that was a boundary I needed to set for my safety. And you know what? It has enhanced my life and it's enhanced all of my relationships. So I feel your pain, whoever is saying, what do I do with my parents, with my family? It's a really tough decision to make. Don't make it lightly, and just know that guilt can subside and you can work through some of those feelings. But again, all the boundaries that need to get to a place before you cut somebody off are your choice, whether it's an emotional boundary for yourself, whether it's a time and energy boundary. I'm just not going to spend that much time with them. I'm only going to do family holidays. And then maybe it'll be, I'm only going to do one family holiday a year, right? There's lots of different ways to set those boundaries. So be creative. And again, like I said before, you might have to lie or manipulate. I'm not condoning that, let's say, but I am saying you do what you need to for safety first. That's what matters. Okay, next question.
Someone else is wondering, what if you have difficulty, you find yourself having difficulty respecting somebody else's boundaries?
Yeah, that's why I mentioned it's not just for you about boundaries, it's for others. Like, I get it, right? We're all going to hit up against that fence because it's in the field that we used to play. Just remember to check in with yourself. What does this person need? They're sharing that with me. They feel they can trust me enough to communicate what their boundaries are, what they need. Remind yourself boundaries enhance relationships. So if I respect this person's boundary, it's going to make us closer. It's very vulnerable to set a boundary. It's saying like, I'm courageous. I need to do this thing for myself, even though you might feel disappointed, or I might feel guilty, or you'll try to guilt me, all of those things. So to set a boundary is vulnerable. So let's make space for it. But I get it. It's hard, especially if we want something. Like, I'm someone that has so many boundaries. I have a whole list. So I'm sure my friends get annoyed by that, but we have to make space for that in our relationships and communicate so that we can still stay together.
And then somebody asked a question, and somebody else didn't respond, sorry, but somebody else messaged me privately with a mantra that I think goes so beautifully hand in hand. Someone wondering if somebody doesn't take to your presentation of the boundary very well. So, for example, they take it personally. So, for example, saying, I don't want to hang out tonight is misinterpreted as, I don't want to hang out with you.
Yeah.
And the mantra that was presented, which is beautiful, and I'm just trying to hear, there's a couple of them actually. Sorry. Just trying to find it here. Oh, here we go. People will meet you as deeply as they met themselves. So just the idea of, it's hard to take it personally, to not take it personally when someone disrespects your boundaries.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just thought that was beautifully intertwined. I don't know if you have anything else to say on that.
I think that, again, because it's not just about us having boundaries, it's about other people as well. The more we do it, the more other people can do it. So that's a bit of what I take away from that. When you say no, it gives someone else permission to say no. And maybe the reason that they cannot respect your boundary is because they don't know how to say no themselves. So maybe if somebody says no to you and you feel hurt, check in with yourself, because maybe it's just, is it because I never am allowed to say no? Is it because I don't set boundaries for myself that I'm so upset that this person is? And I understand that feeling of rejection, but remember, we can communicate. I appreciate that you've asked me to do this thing. I'm just not able to do it. Can we do this other thing? Maybe it's about asking for what you can do instead of just saying no. Maybe that's a negotiation between setting and respecting other people's boundaries. But again, every time I say no, sometimes I get, and you guys, I didn't start having boundaries until like 3 years ago, really, until I started communicating them. It's been hard work. So I just want to be honest about that. But I know that when I set boundaries, I get messages and people talk to me and say, you're so good at boundaries. And I'm just like, wow, that's amazing, because boundaries are so new to me. But I think what they're saying is, because I've said no, they feel like they can. So just feel empowered to say no. I promise you're allowed. I promise.
And then another great question. I mean, there's just so many great questions, but what are your thoughts on nonverbal boundary setting? So for example, someone putting in earbuds, when they don't want to talk to other people at the bus stop or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think there's many ways for us to communicate boundaries. Hopefully we can do as much verbally as we can so that we can be clear, because nonverbals are most of our conversation, but how clear can we be? So I think to be as clear as possible, use your best words, learn how to communicate, but you're totally entitled to do that. I wear headphones when I'm walking around in Toronto because I don't want to talk to anybody. That was pre-COVID, FYI. So I think that you do what you need to. Remember, if you are getting to a place where you're going to set boundaries verbally and strongly, if you need to start with your nonverbals, those are also boundaries. Like if we turn away from somebody, we are communicating quite a bit. So that is up to you, and that is a tool for you to use. So I say use it.
And one more is, how do you move through the guilt of setting boundaries? Because sometimes it inevitably comes with some guilt.
Guilt is so huge. Guilt is something that we carry. It's physically painful for us to carry that guilt. I think that guilt is trying to point to something that we feel like we're going against our values about. That's why we feel it like such a pang. Like we feel so guilty because we don't feel like we're being our best in the world or we're doing something wrong. So just take a look at that. What is guilt showing you a red flag about? And then how can you work through that feeling, you know? So if I'll use my mom as an example, because child relationships are challenging, like you mentioned. So if my mom asks me to do something and I don't want to do it, she will make a grumpy face. She's trying to guilt me. She's an expert at it. And I know that when I feel guilty, it's because I don't want to let her down, because I love her. So the feeling underneath is, you love your mom, but that doesn't mean that I can't set a boundary about my capacity or my time and energy. So it's about saying, I can't do that for you. I can do this other thing for you. Or honestly getting to this really empowered place to just be like, you're responsible for your guilt. I'm not. I wouldn't say that out loud in most cases, but just to tell yourself that they're responsible for their feelings. I think I started by saying we are not responsible for other people's feelings. We cannot control their reaction. I know that that's tough to understand, because we just want to have loving, healthy relationships and for everything to be okay all the time. Just don't know if that's possible. So those are some things to think about. So thanks, Riley. I'm just noticing the time. I just want to say thank you, everyone. Thanks for asking such great questions. Sounds like the chat was going really well. I appreciate that you participated in the polls. It was really cool to see how those answers were evolving. This workshop was brought to you by me, Robin Ocean, Sexual Violence Prevention and Peer Support Coordinator. You can follow us on Instagram at Consent at Trent. You can sign up for our newsletter, tinyletter.com/consent@trent. Thank you, Riley, for your support. I appreciate that you were there to moderate and summarize so beautifully what was in the chat. And special shout out to Amelia Monday, always, for doing all of her great work in orientation and supporting her student staff. And this was brought to you by Student Wellness Center, where Riley works as student crisis coordinator, and I'm at Consent at Trent. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. I'm going to leave you on this resource page so that you can know that everything you've asked were good questions, and you might want to talk more about that, the deepness of guilt, maybe even shame, relationships with parents, and you're not alone to figure that out. So here are some resources on and off campus at Trent. So thank you so much for joining us.